This is the revision video for Unit B2, Evolution. The world is full of millions of different species, but where did they all come from? Why are there so many different species? How do species change or adapt over time? How did all the different species form? Why are some species closely related to each other? Biologists believe that evolution is the answer to these questions. Biologists believe that evolution is the explanation for where all the millions of species in the world come from. There are many different habitats in the world. In each habitat there are organisms that are well adapted to survive. This results in lots of different species. But the habitats of the world are constantly changing, so the organisms must change to survive. Evolution is the gradual change of an organism over time. This idea suggests that gradually one type of organism, called the ancestor, might change over many generations into one or more different species. This generates lots of different species over time. But how do the organisms change? The biologist Charles Darwin suggested an idea to explain how one species can change into another. This is now widely accepted by most biologists and is called natural selection. This theory can be used to explain how the giraffe's long neck evolved. There are 4 major steps in the theory. Firstly, most species produce lots of offspring that show variation. This means there are differences between organisms of the same species. But despite all the offspring produced, the populations remain roughly the same. Why is this? Not all the organisms in a population survive and reproduce. Some die from disease, some starve, some are eaten by predators, and some cannot find a mate. Some of the variations within a population will give those organisms an advantage. If we think about the giraffes, some have longer necks than others. This allows those giraffes with longer necks to reach higher leaves on the trees. When food lower down the trees is scarce, those with shorter necks will struggle to find food and struggle to survive, whereas those with longer necks are much more likely to survive. This is survival of the fittest. Those that survive will reproduce and pass on the genes for this trait, such as giraffes with long necks. Over many generations, the number of giraffes with long necks increases. This results in a giraffe species with longer necks. In summary then, Charles Darwin suggested that species change over time by a process called natural selection. Most species produce lots of offspring, which results in large populations that show lots of variation. Environmental pressures mean that some of the species are more likely to survive than others, and those that survive will reproduce and pass on their advantageous traits to their offspring. Sometimes 2 different groups of the same species can gradually change over time in different ways. This may form new species. Biologists have explained this process in 3 steps. Firstly, the populations become separated by some kind of barrier. This could be geographic, such as a mountain range, a river or sea, or it could be behavioural, such as reproductive seasons not coinciding. Over time, each separated group of the population evolves differently in different conditions on each side of the barrier. The longer they are separated, the more different they become. Eventually, the 2 subpopulations have changed so much that they can no longer interbreed. They have formed separate but closely related species. In this example, we can see the Asian and the African elephants. They are very closely related species that evolved from the same common ancestor many years ago, but they were separated by a geographic barrier of living in different places. Evolution has not always been explained by natural selection. Before Darwin's ideas, there were scientists who put forward other ideas about how evolution occurred. Jean Lamarck was a French biologist who worked before Darwin. He would have explained the evolution of the giraffe in the following way. Within the giraffe population, some of the giraffes want to feed off the leaves high in the trees, so they stretch their necks to reach them, becoming more successful. They then pass on their longer neck to their offspring. This idea put forward by Lamarck is not accepted today. Evidence shows us that the only changes organisms can pass on to their offspring are changes in genes, not changes acquired during their lifetime. Lamarck's theory cannot be accepted because it does not explain the evidence of inheritance by genes. So how did Charles Darwin gather his evidence for evolution by natural selection? Charles Darwin travelled the world on the ship HMS Beagle. During his time there, he made notes on different types of plants and animals that he saw. It was this evidence that helped him to develop his ideas on evolution by natural selection. Darwin published his ideas in 1859 in the book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. At the time, many people were horrified. Other theories were available, and people did not like the idea that humans could have evolved from apes. Most people, including many scientists, based their ideas about where plants and animals came from on the Bible. Darwin's theory of evolution seemed to contradict the Bible, and therefore God. Over time, this theory has been discussed and tested by scientists and is now widely accepted. As new discoveries have been made, such as the knowledge of genes, the theory of natural selection has developed. Alfred Wallace was another biologist who worked around the same time as Darwin. Although he collected lots of evidence, he was not as well known as Darwin, but he did come up with the same idea to explain how species were formed. A good example of evolution occurring due to environmental pressures is the example of the peppered moth. The peppered moth is a common insect in Britain, and there are two forms, a dark form and a light form. The light form has small black specks, just like it has been dusted with pepper, which is where the name comes from. 300 years ago, almost all peppered moths were light. But after the Industrial Revolution, the dark form became much more common in city areas. The dark form of the peppered moth in industrial areas came about due to the fact that the tree surfaces that they live on were dark because of air pollution. The pale lichens which live on trees in countryside areas were killed off by sulfur dioxide. This means that the dark moths were much less likely to be seen and eaten by predators than the light ones. Therefore, the dark moths were the ones that survived and passed on this trait, repeating over generations until the dark moths became the most common in polluted areas. However, in the countryside, where it is much less polluted, the tree surfaces are pale due to pale lichens growing on the tree bark. This means that the lighter coloured moths are less likely to be seen and eaten by predators in these areas. So the light moths are the ones that are more likely to survive and breed and pass on this trait over generations until most of the moths in countryside areas are pale. This has resulted in the two varieties of peppered moths that we see in Britain today. You can see from the map the proportion of dark and light peppered moths found in different areas of Britain today. Light-coloured moths tend to be found in rural countryside areas that are much less polluted, whilst in cities and polluted areas you can see that the dark moths are much more common.